Hello and welcome to a new series of interviews on my podcast and video channel by Dinis Guarda. I'm here to talk about ideas and the biggest solutions and problems humanity is facing, and the questions and challenges, and how we can think bigger and out of the box and make the world a better place. I conduct a series of interviews and profiles with global thought leaders, influencers, experts, and people shaping and creating new narratives, solutions for our world, society, and business industries. These podcast and video interviews are part of the platform that I created, citiesabc.com. That is a new wiki for AR, intelligent smart cities, tech digital platform for reinventing and uniting cities, universities, organizations, and all of us as citizens and as users of technology. Today we have with us someone that I've been working for a long time, and as well a friend, but as well a strong mind and thought leader, Asad Sultan. So Asad Sultan is presently the Chief Executive Officer of Deutsche Malayan Ventures that he created. That is an initiative in Malaysia, but as well been working with Europe, especially Germany, and a lot of other countries, and they will talk about it. He's as well a veteran in investment banking industry that includes almost 2 decades, or more than 2 decades in the investment banking, and as well working between different organizations, initially with the investment bank Cantor Fitzgerald, but as well working with Citibank in New York and Tokyo and London. And as well is the founder of KL Tech City, and he's been working a lot in the bridge between an intersection between Fintech, Society 5.0, 4AR, an intersection of media and tech, and as well as been a film producer, a screenwriter, and a lot of other things. So, Asad, welcome to our series. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Dinis. Glad to be here.
So, Asad, to start, I think in your case it's quite exciting because you are born in India, but then you grew up in the US, and now, and in the past has been working in Hong Kong, but as well in Malibu, and now in Malaysia. So, look around because I think it's wonderful, your global footprint, and as well your career, which is mostly in all continents. I think probably the last continent that you're not so present is probably Latin America. Besides that, you've been all over the world. So just bring us a bit of your history and career.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I've been lucky in the sense that I felt both the challenges as well as the opportunity from looking at industry, looking at experiences from different perspectives. As you said, I was born in India. I went, to boarding school, a British boarding school in India from a very young age. And then I moved to the US for high school, undergraduate, graduate school. So I did my formal schooling, my upper formal schooling in the US. And those were two very contrasting cultures at that time. Almost immediately after finishing my studies, I moved to Tokyo with Citibank, and then to London, and then to Hong Kong. And I spent a good bit of time in Hong Kong, about a decade, working for different banks there, and participating in not just the Hong Kong economic story, but also across Southeast Asia, across South Asia, across East Asia. So it was a pretty broad experience that I had as a banker, and that lasted about 18 years. And since then, I've had another dozen years or so as an entrepreneur, having a series of different business experiences across different industries. So yeah, I think not only from a geographical perspective, but also from a industry perspective, I've had the luxury and also the challenges of looking at it from many different perspectives.
Yeah, I want to touch that because it's quite unique. Someone that was born in India in a very strong culture, and as well in a boarding school, which as well brings the culture even to a new level. But as well, then moving to the US, and mostly grew up in the US because your education years were in the US. So can you tell us a bit about that? Because I think it's very important, especially in the crazy geopolitical world we live, how important this is for all of us. But very few people have this capacity of adaptation, and as well knowledge that comes out of that, because that's a massive wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely broadens your spectrum in terms of the way that you can engage and empathize with different opportunities or challenges. For example, in India, when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, I started boarding school in 1977 when I was 6 years old. And you can imagine that was it was quite a common thing in India at that time for, young kids, especially ones that were expatriates, to return and go to boarding school in India from a young age. But even then, that was quite challenging at 6 years old to leave my family, to have that much independence, and to, grew up in a British sort of hill station near Mumbai, Bombay as it was then. And really the era that we experienced was almost Dickensian. We were living, in the 1900s, not in the 20th century. In the boarding school that I went, the culture, the traditions, the experience we had, for example, and this is something that kids today, your kids and mine, they couldn't fathom, right? But we didn't have, for example, television. We didn't have radio. We didn't have, sometimes we didn't have electricity. So, it was really an experience that contrasted very strongly to the one that I had when I moved to the US at the age of 13 for high school. The US was, at the cusp of the technological kind of development, and it was flooded with media, with pop culture, with music, with television. And this was, I remember when I moved to the US, one of the funny things was that people would ask, like kids would ask me, which bands do you like? And I had no idea, which bands existed. I'd heard of Elvis, and I remember once the Police came to Bombay and had a concert. So I had a couple of names that I could mention, but beyond that, I had no concept whatsoever of, what the pop culture in the West was. Then a place like Cleveland, which was, and still is to this day, where I grew up, a place like Cleveland is very steeped in, classic rock and roll type of culture. Even now, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland, for example. So within a very short period of time, I absorbed a huge amount of pop culture that, that allowed me to look at the world from two completely different perspectives that didn't exist for a lot of my peers. Another interesting thing is growing up in a British boarding school, a very, traditional one, like I said, one that was almost in a different era. We had a command of English language and, and a exposure to literature and, things like that, that was far more, far deeper and far more advanced than what existed in the US. At that time, especially in, kind of not necessarily rural US, but in the Midwest. And it used to blow people's minds that, my command of English was, as a foreigner, as an immigrant, was so far greater than so much in advance of my, my contemporary peers. And all through high school, through my undergraduate, instructors, teachers, professors, they were always telling me that, look, kid, you should be a writer. You should focus on something related to literature or English language. And it's ironic in a way that that's not what I did from a career point of view. It is what I did from a hobby point of view eventually. And, I ended up writing novels and short stories and screenplays. But, it wasn't what I did from a career point of view. I finished my undergraduate and I joined Wall Street, almost by chance. So, you have to be prepared for everything. And I think having that broad, spectrum of experience and different perspectives equipped me for that. Even as a kid, I remember my father was a expatriate in Bahrain, in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and he worked for R.J. Reynolds. At that time, it was the biggest company in the world. He was their, he ended up being their general manager of the outpost that they had in Bahrain. And so, even from a very young age, we traveled a lot across, Europe and Southeast Asia, the Middle East. And so I guess that's COVID has changed that a little bit. I've never stayed at home as long as I have over the last 2-3 months. And I like it. But, all my life I've kind of been moving around. You've known me for a while, and you know that I spend 3 days in one place and then back up and spend another 3 days in another place, That's been kind of the modern experience that a lot of us have in this global world. We call ourselves global citizens, not really Indian or American or Asian, but, really a citizen of the world. And that's something I've certainly done for a long time. But it's nice to have this period of reflection over the last few months, to let it settle in and kind of reflect on, the different habits, not even practices, but habits that you fall into, and how over, this type of a break, you get to change some of the ones that, or enjoy ones that you never had, and change some of the ones that you had before.
Yeah, I want to touch that. This is quite impressive, because I think what you said, that you see yourself, and I see as well, as citizens of the world, but I think we are exceptions because unfortunately most of people live in the same place probably most of their lives, probably 99% of the population worldwide. But one of the things I want to touch from your background that is particularly interesting is, if you see from the 90s or 80s until now, India went through massive transformation. Okay, and like you said, coming from India, and that is a bit like 19th century, then going to the US, that at the time was kind of the most advanced in the world, must have been a massive shock. I want to touch that part, because now we are in a reverse engineer that in 2050, India is going to be probably the second biggest economy in the world, and the US is going to be the third. So how do you see this kind of changes, before we go to your career in finance and as well in film, but starting by this, because I think this is quite interesting for people that have this kind of prejudice, and as well, people are not conscious about how things change in 2 decades or 3. And I think it's really important to look at the shifts of geography, power, economical and social development.
Well, I always like to, if you look at it as an analogy, I like to withdraw from like a 1,000 to 10,000 to 20,000 kind of year view of history. Our modern conception of history is very much a 2,000 year, 2 millennia view of history. This is the modern kind of documented world that we live in, starting with, Egyptian history and Greek history and Roman history. And these are the classical periods that drive, a lot of, even today, contemporary thought and practices, belief systems, etc. But I like to look at history from a longer perspective. And when you come from a place like India, you can appreciate that we also have a 25,000 year history. And, and more we're beginning to recognize that there were ancient civilizations that predated kind of modern civilizations. And so when you look at that more from a cyclical point of view, as opposed to a linear point of view, then I think you have the perspective that there is a constant shift from one culture to another culture, eventually back to the same culture. For most of even the last 2,000 years, India and China constituted the biggest part of the global economy. It's really quite an exception in the industrial era over the last 100, 200 years that the West has dominated. Prior to that, we have another 300 years of colonial era, where again, technologies such as effective use of the commercial channels and shipping. You're Portuguese originally, so you know that. Allowed them to export their own IP in a way that was more competitive. But I look at it as a cyclical thing. I don't look at it as a linear thing. In fact, from a philosophical point of view, I think that's one of the big differences in the way that Western thought is organized and the way that Eastern thought is organized. Eastern thought is very much organized in a cyclical way, whereas Western thought is linear. In the West, like the greatest ideal is someone like Alexander, right? He was born, and by the age of 32, he conquered the world. So it was a very actualized life. Whereas in the East, when Alexander tried to enter or cross the Indus, he saw a sadhu sitting there, and his people, his generals or his army, told the sadhu to bow in obeisance of this conqueror of the universe. And the sadhu looked up and he said, "Oh yeah, conqueror of the universe. I've seen many of them come and go through the millennium." So, when you take that cyclical point of view, then all of this seems much more natural.
That's very interesting, and actually that shows as well your wealth of knowledge and culture. And I think as well, it shows as well the way, and I want to touch that because I think from all my friends in India, there's a sense of history that is completely different from Europe, but different from from US. I mean, US, there's no sense of history in most of the cases because it's a very new country. So from this history, and as well, I want to touch right now your starting in the financial world. So you started in the financial world when it was very Wall Street driven, and as well pre-digital. So you went through all the revolutions, and as well you were working in markets like you start from the US to Tokyo, which is kind of I imagine it was another shock cultural, and you learned Japanese. So can you tell us about that experience starting in the financial industry and investment in the years that was kind of probably wild west in terms of financial industry, but as well very strong experiences as well, to say less.
Yeah, I mean, I did start when I was 21 years old and I finished undergraduate. And before I started graduate school, I was actually signed up at Fordham University. Interestingly enough, while I went to an Anglican boarding school as a kid in India, in the US, I spent my entire education in the Jesuit system. I went to a Jesuit high school, a Jesuit undergrad, a Jesuit grad school. So while I was in between my undergraduate and grad, I switched from Cleveland to New York City to Manhattan, where I went to Fordham, and I was actually a law student, or I was, I'd signed up for law school. And during that summer, it's kind of a long story, so I won't go into it now, but by pure coincidence, my uncle actually happened to be a foreign exchange trader living in Connecticut, and his neighbor was a Citibanker. And, through his introduction, I met him, and through meeting this Citibanker, I ended up getting a job that was almost custom built around my availability. Since I was a graduate student, they put me on the night desk for Japan. And so from the get-go, I was involved in something that was even more exotic. At that time, Japan was an emerging market. Well, not quite, but it was definitely an exotic international market. America was, the American capital markets was very focused on itself. And especially with Glass-Steagall, there was a lot of delineation between banking, corporate banking, investment banking, securities activity. All of that is now, consolidated now. So a group like Citibank at that time was very much a bank as opposed to an investment bank. Today, it does all things. So I started very much with an international perspective, and I started with a lot less organization or hierarchy or formality than a lot of other people who entered the industry would have. First of all, I started in the trading area. The trading area is fundamentally different from investment banking, asset management, in that it's really a much more, I would say it's much more entrepreneurial. It's much more commercially driven than it is academically driven. The investment bankers all came from Ivy League schools, but traders usually were Jewish kids from Brooklyn, So, and that's not that different today. Now it's like, you have a lot of Indians in the trading, in the equity trading or debt trading, the capital markets trading business, because they're naturally gifted traders, especially Gujaratis and other communities from India. I found that out later, but in those days, I was one of the few kind of Jewish guys in the business in India, in New York, in Wall Street, and that was also a different perspective, and I learned a lot from that. But because it was a lot less formal, I was not looking at the organized American markets. I was looking at Japan. B, I wasn't working within normal office hours. I was working kind of like overnight on the trading desk and interfacing with people who were awake or during the trading hours in Japan. And so I had to learn a lot of those. I had to learn a lot of the business on my own without mentorship, without supervision, without formal kind of SOP type training. And I guess that equipped me eventually for life as an entrepreneur, because again, when you shift away from the formal hierarchical kind of commercial and corporate world into the modern entrepreneurial world, where essentially everyone's a one-man band, you need to be able to be very you need to be able to learn things on your own, but you also need to have very strong lateral thinking. So starting with Japan, as soon as I finished I switched from a law degree to a business degree. I finished my master's, and almost as soon as I finished, I was exported to Tokyo first, then London, and then I couldn't handle the UK winters. You live there, but I know that that the UK winters get pretty difficult to deal with, right? Especially as a trader, you'd go to work in the morning at 7 o'clock when it's dark, and you'd come home at 7 o'clock when it's dark, and that went on for 6 months. So that wasn't a lot of fun. And I guess Hong Kong was a lot more fun when I landed here, and so I stuck that one out for a lot longer.
So that's a quite amazing career as well. So I would like to touch your experience, especially in London, when you start a career, how different the markets were for the time, and as well in Tokyo. Could you tell us a bit about that? Because I think it's really interesting to see how the financial industry and investment industry changed, and as well to the point right now that is much more driven by technology. At the time, it was more driven by sales and by markets. Can you just give us, because that's interesting to look at these three of the last 3 decades of trading and investment.
Yeah, well, absolutely. That was an analog business then, and it is a totally digital business now. The skill of a trader is far eclipsed, of a human trader, that is far eclipsed by technology and by algorithmic sort of systems and other quantitative trading tools. So when we started, it was totally analog. We were doing things by hand. We were doing things by kind of almost instinct and gut feel. And when I say doing things, I mean trading a lot of money. We were buying and selling and absorbing information in an analog fashion. That had its advantages. Obviously, it's kind of was why. There was such a it was kind of why the individuals that were able to function within those chaotic environments were so were compensated so extravagantly, right? I mean, they made millions of dollars when people were making $40,000 or $50,000 a year. At 27, I was making $700,000 or $800,000 a year. So that was an advantage if you were able to function in that type of environment. But the use of technology and some, as it started becoming deployed into the financial markets, changed that. And I saw my own career had witnessed that change. Not only the change in culture, as you kind of hinted at, it was very sales driven. It was very relationship driven. It was a people oriented business, especially in a place like London. The city was full of the quote unquote blue bloods and in different environments, whether Wall Street or whether Hong Kong or Tokyo, it was a club that basically ran those businesses. Well, it got democratized, decentralized, if you will, by the use of technology. And parallels of that we've seen in many, many different industries, over the next couple of decades, right? We saw that with personal computing, with internet, with mobile telephony. Now we're seeing it with blockchain. The decentralization of information from institutional into kind of nodes and eventually into individual hands. So I've seen that change in the financial services industry. I mean, the bulk of my experience in banking was 13 years was as a trader, so I can speak to that. I started off, basically just moving bits of paper around, but when I ended, and in fact, the last couple of assignments I had, or jobs that I had within the industry, I was CEO of a company called ITG in Hong Kong, covering Asia. And ITG stood for Investment Technology Group. So we were one of the earliest users of quantitative trading tools, of algorithmic trading tools, of black box matching systems called POSIT, for example, the one that we had, where buyers and sellers could get automatically matched in a system as opposed to by people. So that transition was very apparent in my own career, and I guess we're seeing it now industry by industry. And as we have 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies starting to be deployed and perhaps being accelerated now through the current crisis that we have, we're going to see that change from analog to digital happen in all industries, really, ultimately.
That's quite a fantastic background as well, and that shows as well the intersections that we are right now between business, industries, and as well finance and money. And even the concept of money have been changing. So from this experience, you were as well CEO of a division of an investment bank. Can you tell us a bit, kind of some of the takeovers, so the biggest insights that you got from this career in finance and investment? She's still involved, but as well at the time more directly on the banking and investment industry.
Yeah, well, as I said, I spent, at least from the point of view of my senior appointments, where I ran equity desks, or I was CEO of securities companies or country managers. That was all in Asia. So my experience was in Hong Kong, in India, where I was head of Cantor Fitzgerald in India, in Southeast Asia, where I ran trading desks overseeing growth emerging markets like Malaysia, Indonesia. The development, the experiences that I had saw the development, the emergence of new economies like China. I remember in 2000, when I went to pitch for a mandate for a watchmaking company in Shenzhen, it was really an eye-opening experience. At that time, we still thought of China as a backwater. I remember a lot of my friends from India who were business owners would come in to trade in China, and they were almost paranoid that China would be like this, kind of backward place with not a lot of sophistication and not a great deal of infrastructure. Well, we knew that was changing by 2000 for sure, but really when I went and saw that company, I still remember the name of the company was called Daiwa. It was an eye-opener. We drove into their factory facility, and it was on, tens of acres of land. The size of the facility was absolutely enormous. It was state-of-the-art. The production line was highly automated, and the campus included not only the factory, but also the residential facilities for the employees, a school, medical. That was the China scale, economies of scale manufacturing model. And I saw it, firsthand in the early days in 2000. And at that point, the penny dropped that, wow, these guys are going to be a game changer. I mean, they're going to change the way that, physical goods are made. And they will be at the cutting edge of the use of technology. They would be able to leapfrog and use technologies and efficiencies that a lot of legacy places just wouldn't be able to back end into. They don't have it, and they wouldn't get it. So I saw those type of changes. China was the big one, the 800-pound gorilla that emerged. But Southeast Asia and even places like Korea, for example, in East Asia, have been very interesting. If you look at Korea emerging from the Asian financial crisis in 1997, 1998, it was one of the worst hit. I remember Koreans, the Korean won had gone into free fall. Korean citizens were donating gold into banks to be sent back to the central bank and the treasury of the country to allow them to remain solvent. It was really, an economy that was in insolvency. And over the next couple of decades, Korea has re-emerged and refreshed itself as an innovation economy, as a Japan 2.0, if you will, with some of the most dominating technology companies in the world, some of the most innovative technology inventions, and one of the largest workforce of very highly trained, sort of PhD level educated scientists.
So that touches to one question that we have right now, and that probably one bigger consideration is that the differences of velocities, and as well our countries that were in a very fragile situation are changing the whole system. And you touch as well the concept of leapfrogging. So a lot of these countries are leapfrogging because they didn't have all the legacy systems, and have even the conservative that comes out of sometimes people that get comfortable in their positions. They don't want to change, they don't want to disrupt or innovate. So from that experience, and I think being a citizen of India and then as well growing up in the US and then coming back to Hong Kong and now in Malaysia, how would you see this geographic location, and especially how do you see India and as well Hong Kong and then Malaysia? I think these 3 points are particularly interesting because India in the sense of becoming the second biggest world economy in the next 20 years. And of course, US probably right now in the decadence. Let's see what is going to happen. And as well in the case of Malaysia, which is one of key tiger economy, probably the Southeast Asia market. So just a bit of overview on these 3 levels.
Sure. Well, I mean, that covers a lot of ground, obviously. So I'll kind of stick to a few high-level points on each of them. I mean, I think the U.S. is an economy that is no longer a dominating sort of hegemony around the world, and it has to come to grips with that. But no one should underestimate the vast infrastructure that American government, American commerce, American military industrial complex has on the planet today. At least for the rest of our life, I think we're going to continue to see the U.S. as a dominant force in the global economy, whether or not China leapfrogs it, whether or not other countries develop better use and specializations of various technologies. The U.S. as a whole remains a dominant place, and even today is one of the greatest innovation economies on the planet. Silicon Valley, still houses the big boys of of global tech, and they're all American companies. The Chinese are obviously trying to replicate that with their own version of that, companies like Tencent, etc. But I think the Americans have the best infrastructure on the planet from a digital perspective today, and that will allow them to continue to dominate for some time yet. India is an interesting story because, India trying to become another China is not really feasible and shouldn't even be an aspiration. To try and create the same type of kind of logistical infrastructure, physical infrastructure that China has been able to develop is something probably beyond the grasp of India and beyond the grasp of a democratic country. Institutionally, it's a fundamentally different approach to developing or to rolling out on a broad scale that type of an infrastructure than what was possible in China. However, in India, what you are seeing that is very interesting is a migration because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the physical bottlenecks, because of the great demand, excess over supply. You're seeing a migration of products and services from the physical infrastructure into the digital infrastructure. And India, even earlier, was a player in the tech world, providing call center services, providing software services for global companies. But now that level of sophistication has increased significantly, and the large kind of population that they have and the lack of infrastructure, the lack of physical resources that they have will accelerate India into a digital and etheric type of environment a lot faster than other economies. And because of the size of India, the impact of that will be felt much more greatly. So I think that an interesting contrast between emerging economies and technology is that emerging economies don't have to follow a step-by-step process to catch up to technologically advanced developed societies. They can leapfrog, technologically advanced societies by onboarding newer technologies faster with less resistance from legacy players than a lot of developed economies. We've seen this happen in many industries just going back over the last decade, right? The cellular industry was a great example. Cellular companies that cropped up were independent, and not part of the big telcos, because the big telcos didn't want to cannibalize their own marketplace, their own market share. and so they were slow to onboard those type of technologies, and eventually they had to buy these cellular companies to remain, dominant in their marketplaces. So in Hollywood, we're seeing the same thing happen with digital companies like Netflix and Amazon, Google. I remember when I was in LA in 2012 to 17, the emergence of those companies was accelerating, and it was obvious that these big tech companies didn't see themselves just as tech companies. They saw themselves as integrated media tech conglomerates. And so again, the conventional, media players, the big studios, were slow to react to that, and companies like Netflix and Amazon have eaten their lunch on that. And I think as 4IR technologies start getting rolled out, you will see the same resistance. I think Fintech is a great example. The banks, almost exactly the same situation, where challenger banks are called that exactly for that reason. Neobanks, challenger banks, because they're challenging the conventional banking system. And in doing so, the conventional banks are largely trying to ring fence and protect themselves. But, eventually they're going to have to maybe acquire or get acquired by fintech players that are far more efficient, have far greater reach, are far more ubiquitous in terms of the way that they can access and interact with their customer. And one by one across industries, I think that change is going to happen.
Yeah, so you touch a lot of powerful topics that are really key to reinvent nations and countries. And actually, like you said, there's a lot of different velocities, but as well, there's space for a lot of things. So from your experience in the financial industry to the fintech industry, but as well, see fintech nowadays, and you touch a bit that, but as well, the relationships between investment and blockchain and tokenization, some LDRs that have been working specifically in exchanges, and you're still working and focused.
Yeah, so in fact, that's a good segue to also addressing the other two countries that you mentioned, Hong Kong and China and Malaysia and Southeast Asia. So we talked about the US and India a little bit, but your question is appropriate for, I think, how I see those economies do exactly that, to have the opportunity to compete and leapfrog in areas. So take a country like Malaysia, for example. That's an interesting situation where it's obvious that as Malaysia tries to has an aspiration to become an innovation economy, as it aspires to migrate from a low-cost, low-wages economy to a high-wages, knowledge-based innovation economy, something that Korea has done again in the last couple of decades. It's almost a model that a country like Malaysia wants to follow. But as it does that, it's pretty obvious to me that Malaysia isn't going to be able to compete across the spectrum of that technological change, right? So if you look at things like AI, for example, if you look at robotics, there's just so much investment and so much development and IP that has already kind of taken the lead in places like the US and in Japan, in China, that it would be difficult for a place like Malaysia with its limited resources, its limited size, to compete across the board. So countries like that have to pick and choose the areas within the 4IR spectrum that it wants to compete into. We set up an initiative last year, and you know that because you were part of it and you helped architect that for us, called KL Tech City. The country wanted a digital transformation program, but they didn't know what to digitally transform into. The book that you wrote and actually co-authored with a Malaysian gentleman, my business partner here, Rais Hussain, is titled Reinventing a Nation. 4IR Technologies Reinventing a Nation. So it addressed the blueprint that these countries have to first design for them to find the pockets within that technological spectrum for them to compete in. So if you look at Malaysia, for example, even within a sector like fintech, I think it has to find a niche within fintech that it might uh, uh, have local companies that are competitive into it, might create clusters that are competitive, and it might have the resources to support, an ecosystem or a vertical that is competitive. So, like Islamic fintech, for example, I think Malaysia has a good shot within that subcategory of fintech to develop an ecosystem that is globally competitive, and where they find some white space to, to move around without running into some of the bigger, the bigger, more heavily funded players from, let's say, Silicon Valley or from Europe or from Japan. Within digital asset exchanges, given that the leading money market centers like Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore are very vested in their legacy systems. They're very tied into the into the 1.0 financial services marketplace. So they will be a lot less incentivized and a lot less flexible to move into disruptive fintech and disruptive digital asset exchange marketplaces than countries like Malaysia can, because they have a lot less to lose, and so if you have the luxury like Malaysia has of having common law, of having English language, of having a commonwealth background that makes you conversant with kind of global marketplaces, then you can pick and choose areas like digital asset exchanges, like Islamic fintech, which are niches within the spectrum that will allow you to leapfrog and emerge as far more competitive, as leaders, if you will, around the world. Hong Kong is a different example. Hong Kong is kind of a gateway in and out of a very powerful, leader in not only the global economy. We're talking about China, of course, but also in the emergent technologies. China has the luxury of being able to think in very long time frames. They don't have an election system like democracies have, and because of that, they get to think in generational terms, not in 2-year, 4-year, 5-year election kind of bite cycles. And because of that, they can develop strategies that are far more innovative and far more far-reaching than than many other countries that are democratic systems, or many other countries that are just not as large and therefore don't have the same resources that a country like China enjoys. So Hong Kong becomes a very critical gateway into that marketplace and out of that marketplace. Maybe it's not something that will last forever. I think the Chinese themselves have understood that they need alternatives to Hong Kong, to interact with the rest of the world. But as it exists today, and probably for the near future anyway, Hong Kong has the intellectual capital, it has the regulatory infrastructure, and it has the access to the global marketplace that allows China to interface with the world and allows the world to interface with China.
So 2 parts on that. So you mentioned KL City and the work you've been doing with Rais Yassin, and as well the work in Malaysia, and as well you are the CEO and founder of Deutsche Malayan Ventures. Do you want to highlight especially Deutsche Malayan Ventures and a bit talk more about KL City?
Sure. For that, I'll give you just a little very quick kind of background. So one part of my life that we talked about was my, kind of banking life. And that lasted for, kind of 18 years or so. And then the second part of my life for the last dozen years has been, as an individual businessman, as an entrepreneur, kind of a serial entrepreneur, if you will. And within that time, I've had the opportunity to live in Malaysia. I went back to LA for a while and invested into the intersection of media and technology through a private equity media fund structure that I had created. I also had the opportunity to work with Chinese capital that was exiting China and being invested into the global marketplace in sectors that I had some domain expertise into, namely technology and media. So with that background of things, I was kind of hopping around doing a lot of different businesses. I was in renewable energy. I was in the media technology space, and also coming from a banking background, we were, able to move across. We were conversant, I would say, jack of all trades, conversant in many different industries. So the opportunity that emerged in Malaysia in 2018 was that a government changed in Malaysia for the first time in over 60 years. One of my earlier entrepreneurial ventures in the renewable energy space was in Malaysia, and my business partner at that time was a local businessman who was also quite politically active. So as the change in government happened from the single party state that was in effect since independence to essentially a new opposition coalition, my former business partner happened to be a significant voice within the new government. You met him, and you know that he came in with an agenda and a manifesto for essentially changing a lot of the legacy systems that the political systems that Malaysia had kind of cemented itself into over several decades. That included, by the way, the digital transformation agenda and the mindset change of Malaysia moving from essentially a manufacturing to more more innovation economy, but they didn't really around and heads of government-linked companies signing that blueprint of what the technical transformation, the digital transformation is. I already said that the exercise that along with my local partner here, Rais, who was active in the government, as well as my business partners from Europe, who have a lot of technological expertise and experience investing in technology, especially in Europe, but around the world. So Connie Bursch, for example, who's my partner, is pretty well known across Europe as a super angel and one of the largest investors in digital technology. And even though he's European, we call it Deutsche Malayan for that reason. But he has 15 offices around the world, and they invest in everything from Latin America to Japanese startups. So that seemed to be a good team, to bring to the table here and to explore what type of IP transit we could shepherd into the country to help develop those sectors. So Deutsche Malayan Ventures isn't a formal organization like a Goldman Sachs or like a McKinsey that had a clear, organizational business plan. No, it was more a association that was designed to create the skill set to assist in the transformation, that defining it, resourcing it, and executing it, that we had understood was the government in Malaysia and the private sector in Malaysia wanted to achieve. So I call it more of a venture building model, where we ourselves promote initiatives that then trigger ecosystems around which we can invite different stakeholders to participate in. So one of our main projects that actually spoke to that was called KL Tech City. I think you yourself came to Malaysia a couple of years ago, met with some of the senior government leaders here, and helped design and architect the overall master plan for what a tech city would look like. And what the components of that tech city would be. And as we've moved that model along through various iterations, now we have we've understood that just creating a template is not enough. We have to also populate that template with various initiatives that allow us to, essentially trigger an ecosystem around it. So if we want fintech, we have to bring in fintech initiatives or create fintech initiatives that essentially create commercial activity around it. If we want digital asset exchanges, we have to promote and start, developing those tools around which that economic activity can be created. And if we want, and if we find that that there's a lack in terms of the resources, in terms of the skill set, in terms of the capital, then we create platforms that allow us to draw in capital, that allow us to train resources, that allow us to organize IP so that it can be fed into those initiatives. That's the vision behind KL Tech City, and that's the pragmatic way that we're rolling it out. Now, given that we are not organized as a large institution like a Goldman Sachs or like a McKinsey or like a consulting company or like an investment bank, that means that we have to work with other stakeholders to bring them in and kind of coordinate their activity within this. And that's what we see our role to be.
So from the Deutsche Malayan Ventures, what would be like the major projects that you've been working besides KL Tech City that you could highlight to our audience? Because I know that you've been doing a lot of things in infrastructure, and I think it's quite interesting for countries that are trying to emulate that, and as well even to work with organizations like yours. And I think with the COVID-19 is highlighting a lot of opportunities of collaboration with organizations like yours that actually can accelerate relationships and leapfrog as well a lot of things that sometimes take a huge amount of time because of political, and they can be much more driven in projects, infrastructure, and consolidation of things. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So KL Tech City, is a project specifically specifically designed around the digital transformation. But Deutsche Malayan Ventures was set up as a tool for the government to use to help bring in capital, strategic partners, and IP for their initiatives, for their prioritized projects. So those could range anywhere from building a power plant to building a smart city to divestment of a government asset to acquisition of key resources or key assets. And we've had the luxury of being able to kind of speak to a broad number of the leadership across different ministries, across different states, across different private and government-linked companies over here. But we've been very selective in terms of what we picked and chosen from that list of wish lists. Because if you go and talk to one politician or one government leader or one chief minister, he might have 10 projects. When you go and talk to 10 of them, that's 100 projects. So very quickly, you're looking at too many things to really focus on and be able to execute. So what we've done is actually something far more selective. We've only looked at projects where we can bring in capital, bring in expertise, bring in technologies that isn't available here. There's no value add for me to go and be the 101st guy trying to compete with the local players who already know what they're doing. But there's a great deal of value add for me bringing, filling in the white spaces or the blank spaces that aren't catered to over here with capital from outside, with technology from outside. If you look at the tagline of Deutsche Malayan Ventures when we set it up, we called it precision inbound investment. So we wanted to signal and communicate to the stakeholders here that we were bringing something to the table. We weren't coming here trying to compete for resources, capital from Malaysia to go export outside. We were coming here to offer them additional tools to help achieve their objectives here in the country.
That's very impressive, and I think this is kind of the models that I think I see more and more countries have to take, and as well working in organizations like yours that have both the expertise, both technical and financial, and create relationships. So I want to go from that, and we are passing the 1 hour benchmark of the interview. So one of the things we didn't touch is that you have a huge as well component in terms of balancing different areas of actually, as you put it, I want to use your quote. I think is an interesting one. I think the idea we didn't touch that. We touched just a small part in terms of the levels of media and tech, which is going to be increasingly more important. But I would like to touch your experience, because you have the financial background, the technology background, but as well the media background, having been working and producing some major Hollywood films, or at least being in the set, but as well Bollywood, and as well right now in the music industry, which is kind of an interesting wrap up, because you have not only the financial and investment, the technological, but as well the media and the creative. And as well, you're a writer and as well as screenwriter. So could you highlight that? I think it's quite interesting as well to put on the top of this, because as well, media industries are critical to consolidate narratives and to consolidate as well, even social empowerment and social balance.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's I think that's another 1 hour interview that we can do.
Yes,
we probably
for
should
sure.
do that. But
we'll take it to the next one.
I always thought I'd be a writer, actually. Like I said, I told you about my experience growing up in a British school, and when I moved to America, they were all very charmed by my command of the English language, which everyone thought immigrants speak poor English. I spoke better English than most Americans did, but it was a hobby of mine. After I joined the banking industry, I continued to write. Someone along the way thought that my style was more visual than, descriptive. And so I began writing screenplays, always really a passion of mine, to be honest. And so I tried my hand at writing a couple of screenplays, and even produced a few films myself independently, which later on became quite valuable experience for me when I raised capital for a media fund and became part of the team deploying that, and worked in the cross-border channel between Asia and Hollywood doing that. That actually started in 2008 when I think one of the big Indian groups in conglomerates invested into Steven Spielberg's company. Reliance from India put $500 million into DreamWorks. And we thought that would trigger, a lot of capital from India coming into Hollywood. We already saw that the Chinese were investing, and certainly the Chinese did invest, became the dominant investor in Hollywood. And we thought the same thing would happen from India. It happened to a lesser extent from India, but the logic was that we would create a cross-border platform that would allow us to migrate IP from Hollywood into not just South Asia, not just India, but into the Asian markets, which had a lot of desire for those IPs. And not just films, for example, for distribution in Indian markets or Asian markets, but also things like, theme parks, brands, other type of intellectual property and that was desirable as these markets developed. One of the deals we did, for example, was we brought Virgin Group to India and created a company called Virgin Produced India. So that was a partnership with Richard Branson, focusing on the youth demographic in India, because that is the sort of big bottom of pyramid base in India that is beginning to consume, right, and especially consume on digital channels with the onset and the penetration of broadband and smartphone telephony across India. The consumption appetite of that demographic just grew parabolically, exponentially. And so we were able to bridge those things. We also brought capital from Asia into Hollywood. Hollywood has an unending desire for capital. So that's never going to end. It was the Chinese, and tomorrow will be somebody else. And before that, it was, the Russians. So there's always going to be different guys knocking on the door looking to invest money. But I was more interested in investing not in the conventional sort of film space, but more in the intersection of media and technology. So, we did deals where we invested in companies like IMAX rather than investing in Disney, for example, where we launched our own digital streaming channel. The whole over-the-top play that, that the digital channels offered seemed to me, and ultimately has been a game changer. So that's really where our area of focus has been: IP migration from Hollywood into Asia, and capital from Asia into Hollywood. But really, the interplay of media and technology. What was Virgin Produce India, the partnership we had with Richard Branson, sort of morphed over time to become what today is a music business. We call it Desi hip hop. Desi is sort of Indian, and and the hip hop is one of the large emerging genres that cater to the youth diaspora in India. We learned a lot about that in the exercise we did with Virgin, and so we understood that they consume pop culture through music, through sports, and so we created platforms around that. And so outside of the more conventional venture capital work that we do, and the focus that we have in technology in Deutsche Malayan Ventures and in KL Tech City, these businesses remain part of my portfolio, like the music business, as well as the premium content production business. So making content for the digital channels, and it's a fun part of the business where you get to be more creative, and you get to you get to participate in the sunrise industries where you have this exaggerated growth rates. But as I'm beginning, thanks to people like you, and thanks to the work we're doing in things like KL Tech City, as I'm beginning to get more and more involved in the whole technology world, and for IR technology in particular, I'm beginning to recognize that that's just as creative, that's just as fun, and that's just as exciting as anything you could possibly do in music or films or media. So I guess that's a good spot to kind of stall and to stop it at on this discussion. I mean, I kind of enjoyed talking about a lot of different things, ranging from my background to the geographic mix to the way that countries will leapfrog. So we've kind of been a little bit all over the place, but that's the age we live in right now. There's so much information out there, and I guess our job is to kind of funnel that into ways that it can be brought into action into different segments, sectors, different kind of verticals. And I've had we have the luxury, I guess we're the exception. We have the flexibility, we have the luxury of being able to do it across so many different industries that have different perspectives. So we hopefully will continue to do that, and we'll find some projects that will then scale, and we'll be able to bring in bigger partners, bring in bigger stakeholders, and ultimately bring in a larger audience for it.
No, that's excellent, and you're right. I think it's we live in, especially people in the investment world, you have to have a lot of hats. You have to, and as well, if you work, you have to have the media, the technology, but as well the thought leadership, but as well the research. And increasingly, the barriers and the frontiers between the different areas are disappearing. So one last question, and I think it's more of the personal, but I think it's interesting. And being someone that was on all this culture, and coming back to the beginning question, and I think this is particularly important in COVID-19. So from your experience working all these different cultures, growing up with two massive different cultures, we have the Indian that is a super ancestral and millennial culture, and then the American that is very recent, and then now, of course, Hong Kong is as well millennial, and then as well Malaysia. So I would like to touch this part of the cultural learning you'd like to pass to the audience. And I think especially in this COVID-19 world, what would be the message that you pass from all these experiences, but as well in your work across different nationalities, different business and different industries, but as well being practical as well in keeping the value creation and as well the narrative?
Well, I think the most most important takeaway from COVID is that it will accelerate the decentralization and the hierarchy of societies. What I mean is that we are already on a trend whereby technology and whereby the global economy, the interrelatedness of the global economy has homogenized everyone's access to resources. So someone sitting, we've already experienced in our own, in the pre-COVID world, the ability for someone to sit in one place, run a business in a different place, and have a customer in a completely different place, and do that in an over-the-top way, over the top of the conventional channel way. COVID will accelerate that so that the connectivity of the nodes can increase exponentially, and not just through centralized sources, right? So we don't have to look at centralized authorities to dictate how we organize ourselves. We don't have to look at a geographical restrictions in the way that we're organizing our approach, and we don't have to look at cultural differences as a way of exclusion. They can be, a way of inclusion. In a way, it's ironic, but when we were living in the the pre-COVID world was a far more physically dependent world, and the post-COVID world is a far less physically dependent world. Whether that means that you work less in your office, or you interact less with your community, or whether you rely less upon the traditional, let's say, retail channels. You're not going to the store necessarily to buy your groceries anymore. They come to you through different ways. You're not restricted in communicating in physical face-to-face meetings. I mean, guys like you and me had to get on planes for 3 weeks of the month so that we could go and interact with people around the world. But now we're doing that just as efficiently, and probably far more, in a far greater volume than we have, because we've moved off those physical bottlenecks. So, I think it's a reset for us to look at different ways of doing those, and they're far more empowering to the individual. And that fits in nicely with, I guess, what 4IR is all about, right? It's about basically democratizing information, and yes, with oversight, obviously, from governments, from responsible authorities, but far more with individuals being able to control the value of their own information.
That's fantastic, and I think, well, like you said, there's a lot of questions I want to ask, but I think we'll leave it for the next interview. I would like to touch your experience between Al Yud and Bollywood, and as well a lot of these things, but I think we'll leave it till we pass the 1 hour. So thank you so much, Asad. It's been a privilege. I don't know if you want to just highlight where people can find the information about Deutsche Malayan Ventures, and as well Caltech City. I know that Caltech City has been more like in the inception, but you're going to be doing a lot of the things, and some of the things, I don't know, just for our audience, what you want to highlight.
Sure. Well, Deutsche Malayan we have a corporate website, deutschemalayan.com. I have increasingly at your advice and because of your influence, I've begun pushing more and more commentary out on conventional social media channels like LinkedIn. We publish a lot of these ideas that we have that help support some of these venture building exercises in not only the local press, but also the digital media regionally. I think we'll do more of that. Caltech City has up to now been something of a stealth project, but I just have begun the process of constructing the visual platforms for it, like our websites, our partnerships, our press releases. kltc.com.my is our landing page for that. But we will be rolling out projects and initiatives from that and supporting it through some of the channels that we work with, obviously like LinkedIn, but also channels like yours, like Cities ABC. I think I have published some articles on your platform, and I'm planning on doing more of that. So, yeah, we'll see you around there.
No, it's fantastic, and I think your writing skills are fantastic. So I've been pushing on that, and I think it's important that the world knows about it, not just some. Okay, fantastic. Well, Asad, it's been an honor. We've been here for over an hour, and this will be distributed in a lot of different channels and podcasts and video. And I'm sure we'll follow up for a next one about more of the things that you touch here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dinis. Pleasure.